Hello, everyone. Welcome to the EU Renew webinar series on Europe and the world. I am Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Cornelia Woll, who will discuss her new book, Corporate Crime and Punishment, The Politics of Negotiated Justice in Global Markets, which was published last year by Princeton University Press. Professor Woll is Professor of International Political Economy and President of the Hertie School, Berlin. Previously, she was professor at Sciences Po Paris, where she directed the Max Planck Sciences Po Center on Coping with Instability in Market Societies. Her research focuses on the international political economy and economic sociology, in particular on regulatory issues in the European Union and the United States, and on business-government relations. She is also the author of The Power of Inaction, Bank Bailouts in Comparative Perspective, and also Firm Interest, How Governments Shape Business Lobbying on Global Trade. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Professor Geert van Kelster. Geert is professor at the University of Leuven and the head of Department of European and International Law. He is also a senior fellow of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, adjunct professor at the Brussels campus of American University, and visiting professor at Monash University Faculty of Law, the China EU School of Law in Beijing, and King's College London. He is also an independent legal practitioner at the Brussels Bar and is on the indicative list of WTO panelists. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Cornelia of approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to Geert to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions. And Cornelia will have an opportunity to respond. Then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So feel free to send those questions for the speakers at any point throughout the webinar by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. I will collect these questions to share with the speakers during the audience Q&A, which will follow the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the EU Renew project. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or EU Renew as we call it, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of EU Renew, I would really like to thank Cornelia and Geert for joining us today. And it is now my great pleasure to pass the floor over to Cornelia. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carrie, for this very nice introduction, and thank you for hosting me to speak about my book. And it is about the EU and the world, even though I start with a different question. And I'd like to guide you through why I wrote this book and what I'm trying to argue, maybe with the caveat that when people write a book, often it's because they have too much to say, and I couldn't fit it in an article. I wanted to write an article, but the line is always, if you have one thought, then it's one article. And I had too many thoughts, so I figured I can use chapters and try to walk you through something that is in its whole a little bit complex. But let me start simple and then build it up so we can have a discussion about the content. I started with a question that anybody could ask if they read the newspaper, and I'll just need to make sure. Yes, this is how it goes. If they read the newspaper, and that is, why do we have an increasing number of big multinational companies or companies in general that come into legal battles, settlements, prosecution of various forms, and they make headline news? To me, that was striking because I was in the early days when I was trained as a political scientist, more confronted with hypotheses that suggested that companies are somehow in an area where it's harder to get them punished for some form of misconduct. The traditional assumptions are that companies are particularly mobile. If there is a serious misconduct, criminal law is very national, so companies can possibly escape because they're doing their business abroad. They can do regulatory arbitrage, so do their activities in the countries that have the most lenient setting. And probably most importantly, they have structural power. So companies, because of the wealth they create, the role in the economy, the employment, somehow are in an area of impunity that we wouldn't have if it was individuals, for example. That's the assumptions I came with. And so the headlines that I read, in particular after the last book I wrote on the financial crisis, were striking to me because I asked myself, why do these multinational companies no longer escape some form of legal sanctions in global markets? And that's the question I try to answer in my book. with a story that is focused on the activities in particular of the United States, but it goes around the world. It's an argument about what happens in the world, and there's an empirical part to the argument, and then there's a theoretical part to the argument. So let me walk you through the arguments first, and then I will try to convince you of them. So the answer first, the demonstration a little bit later. The empirical argument I'm trying to defend in this book is, wrong direction, is threefold. First, there is a change in US domestic law, in particular US corporate criminal law, that goes away from courts and towards non-trial resolutions, as one says, so settlements outside of courts in corporate criminal law. And that's something just to understand, and I will walk you through what that means. But that's the first change we see over the last 2 decades. The second change we see, and this is why US developments are relevant for people elsewhere, is that we have what is called extraterritoriality. This is something that legal scholars are very familiar with, but the political scientist has not generally heard of it. But the reach of American law, even domestic law, can go beyond its territory in quite a number of domains and sectors, and this extraterritorial reach has increased for various reasons also in the last 2 decades, and it exposes governments and companies in third countries, so elsewhere, to a degree that previously they hadn't been exposed. And the situation where from the US, the Department of Justice, a prosecutor could go after companies no matter where they are in the activities that they do in these global markets created a very complicated situation, lots of friction, that then explains why within other countries some institutional changes took place that are quite detailed and hard to understand for somebody who's not in these countries, but they all add up to something, and that is the empirical argument that I call the rise of negotiated corporate justice. So a tendency, not just in the US, but also elsewhere, to go towards negotiation in order to settle cases that concern companies, even in criminal law or corporate criminal activities. And the instrument with which that is achieved is something that one can regroup as non-trial solutions. So a prosecutor and a company reaching some form of settlement, and various forms exist. And so I'm trying to show that we move towards these negotiated corporate justice world because there's a lot of changes, not at the global level, but at various domestic levels. And that has implications for the norms that govern how activities take place in these global markets. That's the empirical argument. And why is this the case theoretically? So I should say, excuse myself, I'm a political scientist. I'm not a legal scholar. I tend to, I think our discussant will tell us, but I tend to butcher legal concepts as I go. There's a lot of imprecision in the way that I talk about some very complicated legal settings, but I want to make an argument that is relevant for understanding how in different countries and in different political settings, the law is used and is also used sometimes very politically, very strategically, sometimes within a realm that is much more precise. And that is a story that I think a lot of people working on politics and working on global politics are unfamiliar with. But what I will argue theoretically is that it takes market power in order to be able to expand the extraterritoriality of one's law. So every country makes domestic law as it should. Whether that will apply beyond the borders of that country depends on the economics and on the interdependence in the economic system and on market power. I will also clarify that in many cases, the law can be used strategically in order to defend very specific national interests or norms. And the changes that I observe happen because law crosses boundaries, not as some sort of diffusion of a standard. So I will tell you a story where things started in the United States and then changed and triggered change elsewhere. And it's not a story of Americanization or some sort of diffusion, or legal scholars talk about transplants. I don't think we see transplants here, but what we see is a lot of irritation between different sectoral norms, different national norms, and that friction creates change as a solution. And that change is what I would like to describe in the book. So I talk about irritation rather than something that is more linear. There is a lot of international relations theory about why market power does create change abroad. I want to go over this briefly. If you have questions, please ask me about it. But the shorthand version is that I'm interested in how legal regimes have friction between one another, and how there is a strategic geopolitical element to it, and that is the root of the institutional change that I'm interested in. If you're not interested in theory, you can skip over this. I'll tell you the empirics, but those are the two ambitions of my book. Let me go through its different parts, and in particular, the four I have here. Let me tell you a little bit more in detail what happened in US domestic law, how this became extraterritorial, how sometimes it can create various strategic use of law for the defense of national interests. Here I call it economic lawfare, and how this creates an overall institutional development in global markets. First, the change in domestic law. So this is a very short newspaper coverage version of it, but for a corporate criminality like the Enron scandal, here in the early 2000s, we, even on Netflix series and everywhere else, we do get cases where you have convictions of the management of these companies. In this case here, it's the two Enron chiefs who had prison sentences of over 20 years. One of the two actually served it. And 20 years later, after the financial crisis, people asked, you had the entire subprime crisis brought bankruptcy with it and created a lot of damage, but who of Wall Street is actually in jail? And the New York Times answered this at an anniversary, 10 years after the financial crisis. They published this page listing the CEOs of Wall Street banks sent to jail after the financial crisis, and in a form of journalist activism left the page blank, because there were no longer management convictions, prison sentences, where for company misconduct, people were held accountable. So what happened between the early 2000s and the late the 2020s? What we can see if we look into this, and here you really should talk with the corporate criminal law expert in the United States, but roughly speaking, is a development where the investigation into what happens in companies became so complicated for various reasons that prosecutors had a lot of difficulties bringing cases and actually winning them. What was more promising, and this is something that the Department of Justice supported and facilitated with various guidelines, is to move away from trying companies in court and trying individuals in court, but to use incentives in order to complete these investigations and to negotiate with the companies, most of the time, some sort of settlement. So we see as a consequence an increased use of financial penalties, a shift towards these settlements. In the US, they're mainly called deferred prosecution agreements, and a decrease in the prosecution of individuals in management, and with it, a drop in prison sentences. That's the overall tendency. And there's a data set by somebody called Brandon Garrett, who's tried to put his finger on the overall development here. This is data I will show you only for the federal level, so not all the state, US state jurisdictions, but you can see this in corporate prosecutions at the federal level in the US since the early 2000s. For all sorts of corporate criminal activity. So this goes from competition law to fraud, to securities and bank secrecy violations, export and import cases, which are sanctions violations. For example, we have them in Russia now and talk about them a lot, to corruption, to pharmaceutical or environmental damage. All of these things are in the data set. And we see that even though the number of cases is roughly speaking, not changing a lot. That's the blue line here. The fines increase, and these are billions. So these are a very important number of fines that are being settled on. Sometimes also it's the result of a conviction, but it becomes more and more costly over time. Now, in the same data set for this 20-year period, what we can also see is that this is US domestic law, so corporate criminal law. So the number of cases, that's the bottom bar here, is the majority US companies, about 84%. But the very few foreign companies who are in these litigations, the total amount of fines is paid by companies from abroad. So you see UK companies, German companies, Swiss, Japanese, French companies, all paying very heavy fines, even though they are only a smaller fraction of the total of cases in the data set. So to me, that asks the question, how come these companies from abroad pay such a heavy fine? And I have a long argument about this. There's, of course, selection biases and all the things you should pay attention to. But I was also trying to analyze the data set and to control for how big are the companies, what type of crime are they actually being prosecuted for. And when you do an analysis with the data you have here, where you can control for not a lot, what I find in the detailed analysis is that the likelihood of being fined, everything else equal, so whether it's a publicly held company listed on the stock market or a privately held company, and whether it's the same type of fraud, the likelihood of being fined increases by almost 15% if the company comes from abroad, and the fines that they pay will be 6.6 times larger. So I do conclude that there's a home bias, if you will. US prosecutors will be lighter on the US companies, at least in just this data set. And that is something we need to grapple with and understand, even though the numbers here really don't matter as much because there are other things that may explain them. Okay, so this is the change in the US, a very activist, very much settlement based non-trial solution Department of Justice that increasingly goes after companies and increasingly goes after companies also from abroad. There are a lot of very good reasons of why it can do so, but let me talk to you a little bit about extraterritoriality. And I apologize here to the legal scholars in the room. This is boring to you, but to those that don't know it, it's a real question how you can have jurisdiction as the US Department of Justice over a French bank doing business in Switzerland with Iran, for example. That's the case of BNP Paribas. And the answer is, but they do, and they did. And they got almost 9 billion out of a settlement of a case for these type of activities. And the reason of why you have effective jurisdiction in this case is that the activities that happen in global markets rely on infrastructure such as if you're listed on a stock exchange, if you use settlement systems because you're using the dollar, if you're transmitting data. And these market infrastructures are owned and create rules, in this case by the US. And if it's negotiated, can be enforced because there is an incentive system that the US Department of Justice can use or a prosecutor can use in order to encourage a settlement. So if you have possibly prescriptive jurisdiction and then you have a big market that matters, then you can create this effective jurisdiction even beyond your own boundaries. And you see a little joke here that concerned Credit Suisse. This is 2014, so the old Credit Suisse, which was in a legal battle with the US Department of Justice, ended up with a $2.6 billion fine because, and that is the point of this joke here, this allowed them to maintain their banking license. So the incentive to stay in the US market led the bank to accept to pay $2.6 billion in order to settle a case that maybe, had they been tried in court, would have led a very different result. And of course, the bonus is just a joke, but we've saved what matters most is the banking license, and this logic and this incentive system goes for a lot of the companies that are embroiled in these legal battles. Now, interestingly, the long reach of American law takes very different forms in different sectors. It's quite heretic to work on such a broad set of domains simultaneously because how exactly the US is competent in different cases in competition law is very different from, for example, money laundering and or organized crime or data. But I have one chapter where I just try to show how you can establish a nexus that can create this effective jurisdiction. And it works in several of these cases quite well. It sometimes took over 20 years for those of you who are working on bribery and corruption, for example, but you can establish a nexus and you can create this effective jurisdiction in all of these cases. And the result is that the areas for which we now see payments, so settlements by foreign firms or prosecutions, are typically in these areas you see here: antitrust, tax fraud, foreign corruption, sanctions violations in particular. I want to show you what you don't see in the pie chart, just for those of you who are interested or who are from the NGO side and possibly interested in strategic litigation and activism. I am quite struck how you see here the green pie chart and the, where is it, green and black, or how you don't see it, because there should be a big green and a big black pie chart here as well. We have 97 cases that concerned environmental cases, and we have 18 that, 97 is pollution from ships and 18 is environmental damage. And they don't amount to much. This is why you don't see them. So there are areas for in particular environmental damage or maritime pollution here where there's not much at stake for the companies. And I think that's a question of how much these instruments are used or not used. I can only say that for the number of cases that are tried here, maritime pollution happens all the time, but apparently it doesn't lead to very big settlements. And that's just an observation on my part and invitation to think of why this might be the case. Okay, let me go on, because I'm, of course, running out of time, as always. In the geopolitical perspective now, if you can use your domestic law in order to go after companies abroad, that is, of course, a pretty sharp tool you can use for certain cases if you were a politician that had control over the justice system, which we're not sure if that's the case, but you can try to use it strategically and politically. And that happens most visibly in areas where it's really about foreign policy. So what I am trying to argue in this section here is there are certain cases where companies become the battleground in an interstate conflict, because one government needs to make sure that private actors are actually in line with their foreign policy and has the law and the legal tools as an incentive, as a stick in this case, not as a carrot, to enforce their goals, because, for example, they can cut off access to networks. They want to maintain visibility over activities or create their market reach. And the picture you see here, if you don't recognize it, this is the construction of Nord Stream 2 happening out of the German island of Rügen towards Russia. We all know that this is a project that is now stopped, but for a while it was going on. It was going on because Germany and Europe had a different foreign policy towards Russia than the US, but the US wasn't shy. And this is a picture that comes from the US senators, a group of US senators, including Ted Cruz, were not shy of threatening to sue every single company involved in this construction, saying it violated US sanction rules, even though it might be perfectly legal with respect to the countries that were encouraging this pipeline to be constructed. So companies find themselves in a bind where they need to choose between working in a legal setting from which they may be originally from, or angering a US party and possibly having legal sanctions upon them. And private actors need to be increasingly enrolled in the policies of governments, and these tools can, of course, be part of the toolkit of economic statecraft. Let me go over this. This is just a part that interests maybe the political scientists among you, but the final point I want to make is this means that for governments, there is quite an intricate challenge. And I call this a quest for judicial sovereignty. If you cannot tell your companies what is right or wrong in your jurisdiction anymore, because the US might come in with a different understanding and enforce it extraterritorially, it means governments look bad because they can't control their company. And sometimes they look terribly bad because they might have just been too too benevolent to a company that was really doing criminal activities. Think of Volkswagen and the emissions trading scandal. This was brought by the Environmental Protection Agency of the US. It just looked terrible that nobody in Germany had brought this to attention or had investigated this on the German side. And of course, everybody says, as always, a government is looking the other way when it's their main companies doing bad things. So it takes this enforcement from abroad. So the government has to say, we as well are able to deal with these cases in our boundaries well. And if they need new tools, then they will invent new tools in order to address corporate malfeasance and not have the Americans do the cleaning up at home. And what we see is that because of this challenge, governments in a lot of countries, as the US was using more and more strategically the tools they had developed, were adopting similar type of non-trial solutions in order to settle with companies that else would have been able to get away or to move abroad or to do different things. So we saw deferred prosecution agreements in the United Kingdom as early as 2013. Brazil adopted some type of incentive system and leniency agreement. Spain, France, Colombia changed in 15 and 16. France even invented a new tribunal for economic crimes, financial tribunal it's called. Mexico, Argentina, Canada, Japan, Peru, Singapore, and others adopted similar measures in order to regain this judicial sovereignty. And then I have a very detailed discussion that you should ask me questions about because I won't be able to go through it. The way in which this negotiated justice took hold in different countries does not depend on the legal families. We would tend to think that common law is kind of a negotiation, plea bargaining type of setting, so clearly they might be more likely to do it. And it's true that negotiating what is right or wrong is really foreign to civil law traditions where you don't negotiate. Even plea bargaining wasn't common a couple of decades back. But what I can see in the cases that I study here is that some civil law families really embraced new understanding, not just of corporate criminal liability, but also of these non-trial solutions and settlement agreements that you could have. In particular, France was very active on it. Brazil, to a certain degree as well, in the context of a very massive corruption scandal, which is the Lava Jato case, which obviously required a lot of countries from Latin America to change their institutional tools. But these two civil law countries, I think, are good examples of how far you can move out of your comfort zone and towards something that at the global level makes it more easily possible to actually go after corporate misconduct. And that's the story I'm interested in. With the exception of Germany, always does things differently. Germany resisted this trend until now, despite several proposed legal changes to, for example, have corporate criminal liability and try to deal differently with corporate misconduct. But ask me about Germany if you're interested. I'd like to conclude here simply by summarizing that what I'm trying to argue in the book is that globalization really presents a background for a transformation and a competitive transformation. You try to do as much as the other countries do, but possibly better or in order to be more resilient. And that transformation concerns here corporate justice or how the norms we use in order to deal with what is right and wrong in business activities. That is, normatively speaking, good news because now we can handle some cases that previously we might not have been able to pursue as a global community, but it also has risks. It has risks because in this type of negotiated justice, judges are sidelined and companies are not equal because they negotiate. So big companies can do this better than smaller. Companies from some countries can do this better than from others, etc. And it gives a special status to those companies that will be even structurally powerful in the world economy, and those are typically platform companies. And it's also a risk for domestic systems because it adds to the sense that we have a problem with democratic legitimacy if we don't have a legal system that can present a fair notion of what is right or wrong in business activities. And I see that as a concern as well. But I'll just throw that out there. I'm happy to hear Hertie's questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cornelia, for this very thorough but concise summary of your book. I will immediately turn over to here for some reflections and comments and some questions for Cornelia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Osselburn, and thank you very much, Professor Woll, for your presentation and for sticking to the time. I'm sure that must have delighted Kari. But secondly, and even more, of course, for the book, which I found to be really a very, very good book. I very much enjoyed reading it. And those of you who feel nervous that they might be spending a week or 2 weeks over Christmas and New Year not working, I would suggest that you take the book as hitting the two birds with one stone. On the one hand, reading an enjoyable read, whilst at the same time also reading a work that is very, very well documented and I think really clearly insightful. I have a few comments and then I have a few questions. I suppose the book effectively, I suppose quite a few of you might be surprised at all that there is indeed such a thing as corporate justice or justice for corporate ingressions, and that this should take place through criminal law, of course, because the assumption that many of us have is that largely the sort of capitalist world goes about destroying this planet and not getting much punished for it. That might still be true to some degree, but it is clear that your book offers a number of avenues for hope, where actually in this case criminal law is used very effectively to discipline those corporations involved. The book is, I think, refreshingly detailed. It's clearly based on a lot of empirical research, and you outlined this as well in your presentation. And I do find that really refreshing because much as I enjoy reading papers and pamphlets, etc., on issues that concern current capitalist systems, there is, I think, a lack of books that don't just repeat an argument in various chapters, but with different words, but don't really add much to their initial argument. Your book does that. It really sets out very clearly the starting point of the analysis, but then it takes us through a lot of empirical research, including comparative research, meticulously researched, and I very much enjoyed that. I also liked, and you mentioned that in your presentation as well, the sort of irritation idea of using access to US markets and the sheer size of US markets to try and bring corporations in line, but then also in turn to inspire, if you like, other jurisdictions. And of course, that has a bit of an echo of the Brussels effect. But I like the sort of addition to the Brussels effect, because this idea of the Brussels effect is much more about market mechanisms moving in the direction of EU law and then in turn inspiring governments to adopt similar regulations. Here, of course, first of all, the movement is different. It goes towards the United States rather than towards the EU. And secondly, the idea very much more of this irritation element. And you outlined, I think, in your presentation very well too, the kinds of laws which have this extraterritorial effect. I want to congratulate you, by the way, on your clarity of analysis for those legal issues, despite you acknowledging that you're not a lawyer. I think that's very often the advantage of someone who's not a lawyer, is that you don't feel the need to go to too many details in all the possible nooks and crannies. And I think that's refreshing, because at the end of the day, in my experience and analysis, the extraterritoriality debate is actually quite straightforward, therefore not easy, but much more straightforward, I think, than some of us would like to believe. It's interesting, of course, to note that the US's approach to extraterritoriality, or in simply extending its reach of its laws, first of all, takes place in different areas than the EU does. So the EU is much more about, if you like, the non-market issues like human rights, like environment, like social rights, etc. The United States, arguably, and I think your research certainly shows that, actually has at least the same impact, but then in terms of applying its hardcore corporate and capital laws to all these global forces. And I think it's a very interesting add-on. It's also interesting indeed to see how the EU gets a lot more flack for its alleged extraterritorial regimes than the US do in terms of all their extraterritorial or not outreach. It's also interesting to note, by the way, how the same arguments, namely the size of the market and access to kind of capitalist infrastructure, at least one of those should also really count for the EU, namely the size of the market. Some of the global financial infrastructure in terms of Euroclear, for instance, etc., SWIFT, is located in the EU. So likewise, we would expect to be there much more of an impact by EU law. And of course, that's not the case. One of the reasons there, of course, is that in the EU, we have the absence of harmonization of criminal law, largely. We might have banking and finance regulation, but we don't have a harmonized enforcement. I'm not a criminal lawyer, and I don't know, but it's something that I think some of the audience might know, whether or not the new European Prosecutors Office, whether this might be one of the areas in which it can already, or if not, might want to operate in the future. It's also interesting to see your analysis of the United Kingdom, because of course, even post Brexit, the UK, thanks to its capital markets, I think quite successfully manages to at least copy and or adapt some of those US mechanisms. But I have some questions as well. The first question I think I have is, I very much liked your critique of almost all of the regimes that you look at, in that they arguably fall short of some of the rule of law requirements in terms of transparency. And particularly your analysis of the UK example there, I think is very interesting, because of course the United Kingdom, England and Wales in particular, have a very long-standing tradition and case law on public access to courts, and on that access being open and transparent. It is very rare for English proceedings outside of the family context, of course, not to be open and transparent. And arguably that's less so the case in the examples that you look at. So I was just wondering how you see how one might advance that idea of transparency, because particularly if we are to use this sector as an example of how corporate interest might be held to account, I think it's a very interesting suggestion. The second question I had was on settlements in civil proceedings, which arguably suffer from similar, if not more, shortcomings than the ones that you indicate. Although you also, of course, as I've expressed, indicate the strengths of these issues. There are one or two shortcomings. Civil settlements, of course, have those even more, because they largely do take place in private, and therefore arguably contribute less, perhaps, to global justice, quote unquote, than the criminal avenue might do. So I was just wondering whether in your research you came across some parallels with civil settlements, and any lessons that might be learned from one to the other. And the final question I had was the response, if you like, of corporations to this. It is clear in your research that the authorities in the United States and other jurisdictions have consciously adopted specific avenues to manage this kind of enforcement. I suspect, but don't know, that there must be some sort of a coordinated response internally, some sort of a risk management by corporations as to how they might avoid similar, often painful financially at least, settlements in future. That's probably something which is difficult to unearth unless there is actual litigation which kind of leads to discovery and the release of internal documents. But I was just wondering whether in your research you've come across any kind of coordinated or specific company response to the increase in these mechanisms, and obviously to potentially how to avoid them. In short, I think it's a really excellent book. I think it's a very important contribution to the global justice scholarship, and I congratulate you on it.
Over to you, Cornelia.
Thank you very much. Let me look at the time and also ask, I'd like to answer these questions. Do we afterwards also take questions from the audience? Because then in that case, I'll be rather brief to not eat up too much time. But this is excellent, and I'll be brief on the questions that I don't really know how to answer. So on transparency, my argument is that if we move, and that's what I see, we move towards non-trial solutions. The good non-trial solutions are transparent and harmonized and organized. So you can possibly settle things out of court because it allows you to prosecute a case, get closure on it. But then you should have some sort of sentencing guideline standard for something. What I find very difficult out of the US experience is that sometimes the cases are secret. Nobody knows how exactly the settlement is reached. And you get horrendously particular conditions that are negotiated as part of the settlement. And I think that's what we want to move away from and towards something that is more transparent. And I don't know who does that better. And the UK, for example, has a very restrictive case that the deferred prosecutions are only used in bribery, for example. Or Canada also has adopted it, but uses very little. So it's very circumscribed. If this becomes more of a trend, then transparency is absolutely essential. So I agree with you on that point, and I don't know how we do that well, but it has to be done. That's my short answer. I don't know about parallels with the civil proceedings, but I do know the company perspective to your third question. For the companies, being possibly prosecuted for various things is very unnerving. And they do see that it's becoming a bigger and bigger part. And this comes to a certain degree in the whole bubble of compliance constraints that companies now face. So compliance that they have to abide by is becoming a bigger and bigger portion of corporate activities. And to a certain degree, companies like the fact that there's institutional change on these settlements, because the big change, as other governments are adopting them, and that's something that companies have pushed for, is that they can negotiate together. So Airbus, for example, was jointly negotiating with 3 prosecutors from the UK, France, and I think the US was the last one. So different countries can negotiate with one company. And that is the ideal solution for the company, because in the US, for example, you don't have double jeopardy, so you can be prosecuted twice for exactly the same crime. And that is, of course, what the companies want to avoid. So they want to be able to get done with one case. And if other countries are now building institutional tools to do so, it was the same in the Lavajato case, where the company negotiated with the Brazilian, the Swiss, and the US authorities simultaneously, then for the company, that gives some legal security that they're very much interested in. And I'll take all other questions so I can answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll jump right into the audience Q&A then. We'll start with groups of 3, so that you have some choice in how you respond. So first question is, how does the American corporate criminal law's extraterritorial reach compare to that of Europe's? We've seen lawsuits in European courts against American companies, for example, antitrust lawsuits against Google and Apple. Are there similarities in how these laws are exported abroad, or are they different? Mm-hmm. And a bit relatedly, how do you see any kind of tit for tat with the treatment of American companies abroad? So those two kind of go together. And then what are sort of the implications of negotiated justice for the end goal? Here sort of was getting towards this a little bit, but how does negotiated justice relate to deterring corporate malfeasance? Is it letting companies off easy, or is it more or less the same in the end? And then another question is, looking at the next US administration, will these dynamics look any different under the next US administration? Do you think that this home bias will change with the new Trump administration? Will it increase significantly or not? Is it not that simple? We'll start with those 3.
Yes, thank you. Those are my 3 favorite questions, so thank you for asking them. I try to be brief, but the US and the EU comparison. So the EU, of course, goes after US companies as well, but only in competition law, because that's where there is competence. So we do see cases in competition law, and I have a scholar, Chase Foster, a colleague of mine, who has actually compared competition rulings in the US and in the EU, because it's really comparable here. And he finds something that I take with me. He finds that the home bias I found exists in the US competition, so antitrust rulings. It doesn't exist in the EU. Of course, in the EU, you do have foreign companies as well, but they're not judged more harshly or more often than the European companies that are also judged for competition violations of various kinds. And he explains that the EU process is a very bureaucratic one. It's, it's really commission-led. It's not as political as one may think. This could change, but at the current stage, it seems like the EU competition is really, the Bavarian bureaucracy applies the same to everybody, whereas in the US, it is a bit more political for various reasons. Also because the prosecutors, for example, is a political job. And that explains part of the motivations of what might happen there as well. Is there tit for tat? Currently, no, but that can, of course, happen. This is something that is politically very well studied and understood by the Commission, not so much in the competition, on the competition side, but the under the first von der Leyen Commission, there was an anti-coercion instrument just for this kind of case where EU companies were punished harshly for things that were possibly political reasons. And the instrument was supposed to balance that out and use the competition lever in order to do justice to what was considered hidden foreign policy. So there could be tit for tat in the future. I don't see much of it now on the legal side, but I am very interested in the EU prosecutor because currently the EU prosecutor can't do much because there is no harmonization of criminal law in the EU. So the prosecutor really has no ground in order to do something, in particular, not what here is prosecutorial activism. I don't expect the EU prosecutor to become activist anytime in the future. Because there's no grounds for that currently. What is the implications for the end goal to me are very much, it really depends. I have days where I'm excited because you can bring cases and close them and they're important cases. And you can also see that for the victims of this malfeasance, that matters a great deal. But with all the biases and problems that we wouldn't want, the US, just on the US side with these deferred prosecution settlements, has a lot of studies where it's shown that the companies who've been who negotiated a deferred prosecution settlement, for example, don't stop to the recidivism. So they repeatedly engage in exactly the same activities. And if you defer prosecution, it immediately should then trigger prosecution, but you can go once or twice or three times into deferring prosecution for exactly the same case, which is absolutely nonsensical. So I'm not so optimistic that it necessarily means we're heading towards a better world, but at least we're heading in that direction, and let's make sure we figure out how to do it well. And then the US administration, I have a very short and clear answer on it. Everything I told you is going to be irrelevant under Trump. Is the shorthand, because if you look at the data where I had the bars, you see a dip in the middle, which is why you didn't get a nice curve. And the dip is the first Trump administration. Trump does not like to go after corporate criminal activity, period. His Department of Justice won't do it. He, in terms of foreign policy, won't use these instruments. These are very sharp, effective, detailed and nuanced instruments. And his foreign economic policy tool of choice is tariffs. So he runs around with a big tariff baseball bat, and he won't use all of this very detailed material. My hunch, but we'll see.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to a second round of questions. So following up on that final question, that final answer that you just gave us, I was wondering if you could try to do a little bit more crystal ball gazing and predict the future a bit more. Where do you think the prosecution of corporate crime will go in the future? We have another question about the new EU directive, the protection of environment through criminal law. Do you think this will make a difference in terms of the prosecution of environmental crime in the EU? And another one on transparency, we have, it says, non-US jurisdictions have studied the negative aspects of US practice and in contrast require judicial approval of their negotiated agreements. Does not the inclusion of a judicial approval mechanism address some of the concerns of transparency? And then maybe just a tag-on question, since I don't think we'll have time for another round, is could you maybe clarify how your empirical results sort of challenge, amend, or confirm some of those few traditional assumptions that you started with? I think it was the first or second slide.
Yeah. So let me take 4 and 5 together because I don't know enough about the innovation now on environmental crime, but the crystal ball, where does this take us? I think that depends on how people use it. There's a set of instruments here, and for various reasons, the different market participants, I mean, companies have been driving anti-corruption, because they say, why would our anti-corruption law apply to us as US companies and everybody else is doing corruption? And this is where the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was pushed into something that had teeth in the rest of the world. And really this was company driven because it concerned competition. I can see it perfectly possible that on environmental litigation, if some people use it strategically and develop it, it can be just as impactful, but somebody has to take it in its hands and drive it. So I think that crystal ball is open and depends on where the political activity goes. Is judicial approval a good mechanism? Yes, absolutely. Because if you have a judge go over something that was settled, the judge's task is to be as impartial as possible and make sure this is as standardized as possible. And again, let me just cite you an example. One of the first deferred prosecution agreements in the US that was negotiated was a prosecutor just finally able to sit down with company representatives and say, we won't prosecute you if you do this, that, you pay that much. If you pay that much, then you're not guilty. And by the way, can you endow a research chair at my alma mater? And the company said yes. And I mean, how partial is this, and why the alma mater of the prosecutor who was sitting there? It makes no sense whatsoever. If a judge looks at it, and they would say, in comparable cases, we've done this, this is reasonable, this is not. And also the question, how many billions are enough? I'm even unable to answer to you, is an 8 billion settlement for some specific crime the right or the wrong amount? Maybe that's actually very little. We don't know. We don't know how much the company benefited from the crime that they're accused of. Maybe they have actually benefited a lot. So that is the task really of somebody who has sentencing guidelines, mechanisms to evaluate what would be appropriate. And that is precisely what the commission does very well in competition law, because they know how to calculate what the size here of the advantage was and what the sanction should be. So judicial approval is absolutely a good thing. I encourage it, and where it doesn't take place should be established immediately. And empirically, the questions that I answered in the beginning, companies still have structural power and are still a privileged player on markets. But I mean, the good news here is public actors, governments, and judicial actors are catching up with that. And they found instruments in order to at least prosecute some things in these global markets. And I think that is in itself good news. The challenge now is to get it right. And I think that challenge is yet to be mastered by all those who care for these different cases.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have for today. I think another round of questions will push us over the edge. So I know we have a hard stop on the hour. So I would like to once again thank all of our guests, and especially Professor Cornelia Woll and Professor Geert van Kelster for joining us today and taking part in this webinar. And before leaving you, I would like to announce a couple of our upcoming webinars. Our 2025 spring and winter lineup is already announced on the website. You can find that at eu-renew.eu. Our first webinar of the year will be held on January 16th, and we'll bring in Anita Godis. And you can check out our full lineup, which will feature Mark Purdon, Sung-Yun Cho, Hilke Dijkstra, and Petra Mavroidis. You can sign up for all of those at eu-renew.eu. So thanks very much again for joining us today, Professor Woll and Professor van Kelster, and all of the audience. And we'll see you in 2025.
Thank you very much for having me. And I'm very happy you continue with my good colleague, Anita Godis. She's written a fantastic book, so you'll start off well in 2025.
Great. So sign up for that one. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Woll. Bye-bye.